What have you seen as the impact really of e-commerce and the internet on the supply chain and on how it works?
Yeah, well, I think you want to start with the customers, with all of us. And the internet has really put us, you and me and everybody else out there in charge in a way that we've never seen before. That the world, in the era of mass media, companies only would run a television ad for whatever product they were selling. And then they would just kind of pump that down your throat, and they only needed to have a limited number of SKUs, whatever was on television, basically. Customers didn't have a lot of choice. They could buy this, the Energizer or the Duracell, and there were two choices for what battery, and they happened to be in the stores, and so the brands were in control. Those who could afford mass media were in control. Now with the internet, there's just like a million choices. You have every kind of possible brand of battery that's out there. Battery is probably a weird case, but still, for every product category, there's a million choices. Everybody's unique. You can get the thing that matches your own personal taste. You are in charge as well in that they better have that product now. You're not willing to wait a week. Like in the Sears catalog era, you could order and you get it in 3 weeks. Well, you're going to go out of business if you can't deliver. It's becoming 2-hour delivery. Like if you can't deliver 2 hours. And so that is a very different supply chain. And what's happened is companies that haven't been able to run a supply chain that's that responsive, that can have a wider assortment of choices, because we're all unique and we want our choices, and have it sort of edge cached, to use an internet analogy, like a CDN. Like you want to have these goods like close to the customer so that it can get there really, really fast. The old world, you could have one distribution center in the middle of the United States and distribute out to your store network from there. But it didn't have to be like super responsive to customer demand. Customer demand was pretty predictable, kind of always bought the same number of these batteries or whatever product. And it didn't have to be very agile. The modern world, all of a sudden, there's this proliferation of brands, and it all has to be stored close to the edges. So brands need to have multiple fulfillment centers. You need about 5 fulfillment centers to get 2-day delivery nationwide. And you need probably to do next day, it's more like 16 fulfillment centers. And you want to do same day, well, you need one in almost every zip code, right? If you want to have 2-hour delivery. So that's a really, really different configuration of supply chain. And now you want to be able to get to that world where you're doing same day or next day delivery. You now need to load balance your inventory. Because if you put too much inventory out there and it doesn't sell, you're going to go bankrupt, right? You're sitting on all this working capital, this inventory that's not earning a return. Too little, and you lose the customer, and they'll never come back, right? They buy your competitor's brand. And so that's the fundamental problem. And these logistics teams don't even really, at the typical brand, don't even really know that that's the problem they're solving. They're just still used to a world where all they care about is the price of freight. And they want to buy the cheapest freight, and that's what they think their job is. When their job has become, how do I ensure a customer experience? How do I enable our sales and marketing to have the product in stock so that they can win those customers, be a growth engine and a customer experience engine? And then how do they empower their CFO to not sit on too much inventory? And so it's a really different proposition. And frankly, most of the companies that we grew up with, these iconic brands, have been going bankrupt left and right. If you Google retail apocalypse, just look like the number of companies that have failed that are iconic brands that we grew up with. It's really sad, actually. And I don't think it has to be that way. So we kind of have dual purpose here. One is help the new age of brands rise up and not need to hire this big logistics supply chain team who just pushes paper and just all they care about is the price of freight, but actually is empowered to solve these problems without hiring a big team, because you don't need it anymore. You kind of outsource that to the cloud. That's one aspect of what we do, help these small businesses grow really fast without the bureaucracy. The other is, how do you help these enterprise brands, these famous companies, transform themselves for a world of e-commerce and not die? I think that both of these are really important missions for us.
Yeah, and in some sense, the second one, I think, can almost be harder. And I've heard you say kind of in the past that like one of your goals is to make the supply chain like as resilient and reliable as the power grid.
Yeah.
And it's like one thing to do that, in normal times. It's another thing to do it as you kind of have like a pandemic occurring. You now have like a war in Ukraine that are creating these kind of delays and disruptions and shortages that we read about. What will it take to get the supply chain kind of to that point, and in particular, kind of because you're talking about an architectural shift, really, of the supply chain. What will it take to help those legacy players get there?
Well, the fundamental problem in supply chain is that it is that word chain. That there's many companies. In fact, on a typical transaction where we're moving, let's say, a pallet of goods, cubic meter of goods from a factory in pick a city in Hangzhou, China, to St. Louis, Missouri. If you on a transaction like that, you'll have at least 12 companies that either touch the goods physically or are involved providing capital, like a trade finance or a letter of credit, cargo insurance, and bank payments. 12, at least 12, and as many as 20 companies involved in that transaction. And so you get information bottlenecks. The goods bottlenecks are famous, and we see the ships waiting offshore and all the problems. But what's happening in parallel is that the data is not flowing. That people at each stage are having to rekey data into a system or not bothering. Forwarding PDFs. We call it freight forwarding. I often joke it should be called freight email forwarding because you're just emailing attachments between all these different companies and trying to wrangle it. And so it leads to suboptimal decision making. If you had perfect information, you would be able to make sure that truck is waiting at the airport when the plane lands or at the seaport when the container shows up, and you would get it all dialed in, and every truck would be scheduled appropriately, and you would be replanning every 5 minutes so that if there's any delay, you're like automatically generating a new plan and reallocating containers. Okay. Almost none of that can happen because there's not a system. It's 12 different companies, each running their own IT system, or in many cases, guys with clipboards in warehouses, like no IT system at all on paper. And so there's two possible solutions to this. One is a giant mega corporation owns all the assets door to door and creates one IT backbone for everybody. The other is use machine learning and data science and make it in the interest of these asset owners to participate, to come onto the platform.
Almost like data is the new kind of killer asset.
It should be, and you should be able to really generate insights. The more transactions that are flowing, the smarter you get. How are we going to route this container?
Yeah.
Know in advance. Oh, you know what? There's actually a bottleneck in LA right now. Let's route it through Oakland.
Yeah.
Things like this that the industry hasn't been that good at. It was really interesting to watch last year. We had 100 container ships waiting off the port of LA, and only 5 waiting off the coast of Oakland here in the Bay. And you're like, why don't you have to go past Oakland to get to LA? Why don't they stop? Just unload the stuff. And it's hard. They don't have the data. They're not able to communicate in real time, make agile decisions, et cetera. So, but that's going to be the future, is actually like using tech and using data to route assets in a smarter way.